Ilana Golbin is a director in PwC Labs, where she serves as one of the leads for artificial intelligence. She specializes in applying machine learning and simulation modeling to address client needs across sectors, with a focus on strategic deployment of new services, operational efficiencies, geospatial analytics, explainability, and bias. Ilana is a certified ethical emerging technologist, and in 2020, she was listed as one of 100 brilliant women in AI ethics, and was recently recognized by Forbes as one of 15 leaders advancing ethical AI. Since 2018, she has led PwC's efforts globally in the development of cutting-edge approaches to build and deploy responsible AI. Ilana, I am so excited to talk with you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you today.
Awesome. So I want to spend our time talking together about advances in artificial intelligence, new technologies like generative AI, and really, since we've got you here today, really focusing on how we should be thinking about responsible use of these technologies. It's obviously an exciting time with lots of possibilities, but we're in an industry like healthcare here. We have to really make sure we get it right from the very start. So let's just start with the basics here. In the simplest terms, how do you define responsible AI?
I mean, this is a good question. And even before I get into defining responsible AI, I want to echo what you're saying, that this is a very important time that we find ourselves in, a very exciting time that we find ourselves in. And what I find very intriguing about the moment that we're in right now is not only are people across all different industries identifying new opportunities for AI more broadly, as well as specifically in generative AI, but there's also a growing recognition of risks and considerations that we need to be moving forward with as organizations. So, with that in mind, how I define responsible AI, which I'm sure there are many definitions floating out around there, is really a methodology for organizations to follow that allows them to consider the intentional and unintentional implications of the systems that they're building. And that actually requires actions and considerations at a multitude of levels. The first is by considering the strategic use cases that an organization might even undergo. And I start with strategy and use cases because it's really crucial for businesses and organizations in all different spaces to have an appreciation and a focus for how they want to apply this technology. That focus also should reflect their unique perspective on ethics and values, as well as the industry that they find themselves in and the unique considerations of that industry. So really establishing the space in which a company is planning on operating, that I think is crucial. Once you have that in mind, then it's an exercise of establishing the appropriate governance practices to effectuate that. Governance has to be closely coupled to the strategy. It can't be an afterthought. It can't be something that's implemented on the side without a recognition of use cases or how technology is ultimately used. And that's for a few things or a few reasons. It's not just because we don't want to inhibit innovation, but it's also because the practices that we abide by from a governance perspective need to make sense in the context of the systems that we're building. Governance needs to be risk-based. It needs to be proportional to the consequences or potential harms of a system. It needs to be very much driven by the principles and practices and values that an organization wants to uphold. That's how we can alleviate some of the tensions that sometimes evolve within organizations. And that's crucial from a responsible AI perspective. But it goes further than that too. It's recognizing that there is or should be an appropriate model development lifecycle or process that's undertaken to formulate a problem or opportunities the right way, meaning tied to business outcomes, tied to potential risks and harms, and really thinking about what it means to build a high quality system in the context of a number of different success criteria. So that's fairly broad, and it touches on a lot of different spaces that organizations have to evolve in the climate that we find ourselves in today. But responsible AI in and of itself is a fairly intersectional discipline. It can't be its own team off to the side there to check and challenge. Otherwise, it won't really be providing much value to a business.
Yeah, to that point, I wonder, like, who do you find at most institutions is most well positioned to be the primary stakeholder leading the charge on this?
It's a difficult question to answer because it could really be any number of people. And it comes down to a few different factors that are fairly specific to an organization. One is who wants to do it, which categorically, sometimes that's very different in different spaces within different organizations. But if someone feels the need to be driving this forward, they'll be a bigger champion and a bigger change maker within an organization, or at least that's how I feel. But the other counterpoint to that too is that person has to be provided that remit, a recognized remit across the organization. Because just because you want to do something doesn't mean that other people feel like you should be the one driving it. So what we see evolving within a lot of modern organizations is a operation by committee. So you have one person who's ultimately accountable. That might be someone from the risk function or second line function. It could be like a chief privacy officer or a compliance officer. It could also be someone from the data and analytics function. It could be the legal officer. It really could be anybody. But one person who's ultimately accountable and responsible for driving the overall program. But then there's a committee that supports them that has representation from different business units, functional units, so that the practices that are evolved by that function make sense and are something that has buy-in and commitment across the org. And again, I think this is because I don't view governance and responsible AI as a hindrance to adoption of AI. I think it's part of the process that we have to follow when we think about which use cases we need to be enabling. There are a large number of fairly low risk use cases that could materialize significant value for organizations, but those aren't always the cool ones. And they're not always the ones that get prioritized first by different business units. And we could also be overlooking commonalities. We're building simple capabilities, or singular capabilities could be reused across functional groups. So this type of a coordinating function becomes valuable for a number of reasons. They also, frankly, help identify practices that already exist within certain spaces that could be leveraged in the process of standing up a program. I talked about privacy for a second here. There are existing processes in place for HIPAA compliance, for performing privacy impact assessments or intake processes around privacy. That's a space where we see quite a bit of complementary capabilities with the AI programs because we're looking at using data, and those programs are there to oversee the usage of data.
I think that's really important. So it sounds like you're saying don't start over and reinvent the wheel in your organization just because we're saying responsible AI, that there's a lot of existing capabilities that most organizations already have. And this is creating a new coordinating center for them to focus on. Is that right?
Yes, and candidly, it's also an opportunity to reinvest in some of those programs and assess where they could be improved. The unfortunate reality is that some of these programs historically have been lagging functions, meaning that you'd move forward and build something, and at the very end you'd say, hey, I need to get this deployed tomorrow. Can I get your stamp of approval on it? Which, of course, I'm being a little facetious here, but that's not the appropriate methodology, and that's not what a lot of these teams would have liked. But for a number of reasons, they tend to be the reactive group, the people that are brought in at the very end. So thinking about how we can engage those activities earlier on in the life cycle, get that feedback earlier on, it allows for more streamlined adoption of technology and candidly a better experience for us as developers or creators of technology. If you can think about what all those potential landmines might be a little bit earlier on in the pike. The other thing I'll mention too, though, is again, I think we're at an interesting time because there are so many public discussions and emerging recognitions of the risks in this space. So there are more people who care about these topics, and I firmly believe most people within organizations want to do the right thing, but there are more champions evolving around these responsible AI capabilities I've seen over the last year, especially. And those people can be tapped to support any type of program rollout. So really enabling effective governance process, a growing notion of responsible AI, an appreciation of the should we even build this mentality, or can we reduce the risk of this type of a use case by adopting simpler methods, mentality, by engaging from both the top down and the bottom up.
Incredibly helpful. And I'm going to put a pin. I heard you say a couple of things I want to circle back around to. One is about, that this doesn't have to be a hindrance, and can actually serve as accelerant, and also moving things like privacy in this context from being a lagging function to actually part of forming the strategy. So I'm going to put a pin in those. One thing I want to ask you about is there's, some organizations will be building AI and other organizations will be deploying AI. Should they be looking at those at everything you're talking about differently? Does this look different if you're a builder versus if you're an implementer?
There are some commonalities and there are going to be some differences. So builders of technology that are making it available as vendors essentially to other organizations, they're in a position where they only understand the context of the users that they've created a system for. They are not actually residing within the four walls of the organization that has the full context of the users who will be leveraging that tool. So they have a responsibility to think about how they adopt fairly straightforward standardized model development practices, making it easy or easier for potential procurers of that technology or adopters of that technology to understand what practices they abided by, to understand what testing they performed, and under what conditions their technology will be effective. That's their responsibility. The deployers, the implementers of technology, they bear the responsibility of thinking about what they need from those vendors to feel comfortable bringing that technology in-house. They might have their own practices in place or own requirements around AI systems. Maybe they're also building on their own. They know their users, they know their impacted parties better than that vendor. I would say that's in theory. There are probably some differences around that. But it's their responsibility as the deployer of that technology to test how that tech works in practice in the processes in which they're implementing it. And I do think that there is this collaboration that tends to evolve between the developers and the deployers because, again, I don't think developers are looking to build tech that's ineffective. They want to build effective technology. And the deployers of that technology want to implement technology that's valuable for them. So finding that the opportunity to collaborate to build even a better product at the end of the day, I think is highly valuable. The other piece I'll mention there too is, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so full disclosure there, but some of the emerging legislation, or I would say legislative activity that we've seen around this, does seem to put a fair bit of the burden on the deployer because they do know more about and should bear the responsibility ultimately of the technology that they're implementing. The recent law in New York City around assessing automated systems for hiring for bias is a great example of that. The onus is entirely on the deployer of that technology.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'm sure there will be a lot of people listening to this who are immediately running to go look that court case up. I'm wondering, can you share a couple of examples? I think we all can imagine lots of places where responsible AI can go wrong. Can you actually start with the other side of it? Like, where are a couple of examples of where someone's done this right, where it's gone really well, and you've seen an organization, whether it's a builder or a deployer, really embody the principles of responsible AI and set things up in a way that feels like they're doing it right?
I will off the bat say that we hear more about the bad, the inappropriate or improper implementations than we hear about the good ones. It's because it's also good for us to be aware of that. And I also have I'm a consultant. I work for a consulting firm, so I also have a spreadsheet where I track different bad AI use cases, as I affectionately call them, or system failures. And we're over 200 now in our spreadsheet since I started it back in 2019. So it's rapidly evolving. I think organizations that are moving forward with AI in a responsible manner just don't hit headlines very much because they are trying to manage the risk. And when I think about an organization that might be following practices appropriately, that's also an evolving world. The practices around responsible AI a year and a half ago look somewhat different than the ones today because we now have generative AI applications that we have to consider. So it's a newer form. So it's a recognition that those practices are always going to be evolving. But organizations that lead with their values, that drive governance programs that are proportional to risk, that have a close collaboration between their development teams and their compliance teams or other second line teams, those organizations are doing it right. Setting forth an intention making that intention known through training programs so all staff across the org understand this is our mission. Here's how we're going to achieve that mission using machine learning and AI systems. Here are the risks that we are mindful of and the measures we're taking to mitigate those. You all have a responsibility as stewards and trusted employees of this organization. Voice when you feel like we are not doing something correctly or when you think we can improve. It's a lot of this is culture change too, to incorporate those types of practices as well as following through with the appropriate governance. So I don't have too many examples of companies quote unquote doing it right that we can share publicly, but I know that there are a lot of organizations that care about this topic and are actively working to incorporate these types of practices within their organizations because they want to do the right thing and they feel like if they can't adopt appropriate responsible AI driven governance practices, then they won't achieve the value or the promise of value that AI systems can hold. And so I think this is an important point. And going back to the piece I mentioned earlier that you wanted to put a pin on about governance potentially being a hindrance or a blocker to innovation, I don't believe at all that a good governance program is a hindrance to innovation. I think it's an accelerant for innovation. And the example I give is that we can drive faster on roads because we have brakes in cars and we wear seatbelts and we have rules of the road. Generally, we have notions of governance that surround us. We know where we shouldn't go. We know how we can utilize capabilities to our benefit so that we can move faster. I think that it's all about streamlining that, making it clear that the processes we're implementing are there to help us navigate difficult conversations around risk and the trade offs associated with building high value systems and investing in systems that can really make an impact for our business and for our constituents, patients, broader healthcare ecosystem, doctors, any potential user or impacted party.
I love that driving analogy. It's so vivid and makes so much sense. So essentially, you're saying to move faster and innovate, organizations should be clear in the rules of the road, in what the guardrails are, and that will allow innovation to move because people will understand what those guardrails are.
Exactly. I said this at the top. I'm a data scientist first and foremost. It's incredibly frustrating to spend a lot of time building something and to find out at the very last minute that you've wasted your time. It's a great way to set up an adversarial relationship between the builders of technology and compliance functions too. So navigating all of that a priori makes the whole ecosystem run a little bit more smoothly. Now, I think it's going to take us time to get there, and there are going to be starts and stops within enterprises. But if we're all aligned on that being the vision for governance, that governance is as formally a strategic capability, then I think we will build better systems at the end of the day. And again, part of this is too that AI systems don't work in isolation and very discrete processes. They're what's referred to as a socio-technical system. So they have broader impacts outside of just the one decision that they're making. And the whole environment then impacts how those systems will operate in the future. So we need to be very thoughtful about governance, about risk, about requirements for oversight, because we're not just predicting one number on a spreadsheet, we're impacting real people's lives. And of course, there's a spectrum to that, but if you want people to trust systems, they need to be well governed, and we need to be thinking about what requirements those users or impacted parties actually have to engender that trust with systems.
So I know everyone's wondering, and I am too. So you teased the conversation with this spreadsheet with 200 rows of all of the AI done wrong. So let's go back there for a second. What are some of the most common themes? As you look at that
Mhm.
spreadsheet, you've been gathering data for 4 years on this. I think it's important to say. I heard you talking about responsible AI well before it became popularized, which is why we're so excited to talk to you today. What are the themes on that spreadsheet? What are the top themes for where organizations are going wrong here?
What I think is interesting is the themes have evolved over the years. So when I started the spreadsheet, there were a lot of entries around bias, and the bias entries were focused on specific examples like resume screening or pulse oximeter was another one that ended up on that spreadsheet pretty early on. So it was one-off examples of bias, people not necessarily thinking through where the source of the data was coming from and the discrepancies present in that data that would lead to potentially discriminatory or disparate impact outcomes, right? So that was the first phase. The second phase was like an onslaught of facial recognition, which is really just a continuation of the first one, but a growing awareness that there were more and more of these implementations of facial recognition systems corresponding with an increase of these independent tests showcasing that these technologies were trained on biased data and were not actually giving us highly accurate outputs for people of different genders and different racial backgrounds. And there are a number of independent tests that ended up validating that. One came from NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So that was kind of the second trajectory. Then I think we kind of settled down a little bit on facial recognition, and biometrics became a little bit more important. And then now we've hit Gen AI, and the Gen AI, bad, quote unquote, bad AI use cases are more like, some of them are more potential misuses. So people prompting or getting outputs out of a chat interface that is not in alignment with what they would expect to be a good outcome. So that's one. Two is these technologies being misapplied. So people not really understanding what the technology can really do and using it in inappropriate contexts. There was a great example of a lawyer that prepared a brief. This went to New York Times too. And he did all of his research using a popular generative AI technology on the internet, and just filed a brief without double checking any of the citations or references, and all of them were made up, which I would argue you should probably double check your work anyways if you're using an automated system. So again, people not appreciating what the technology really does and where its limitations might be. And there have been a number of those too. Just this past week, there was an example of a supermarket chain in I think it was New Zealand, that had a resume create or not a resume, a recipe creating tool on their website where you could say, I have these following items in my refrigerator. What can I make? And apparently, if you prompt it saying, I have, I think it was ammonia and water, what can I make? And it was like, you can make chlorine gas, but they called it an elixir of some kind. So these are I would say, not realistic, but misuses of the technology, as well as some very real harmful consequences around some of the generative AI technologies converting people's photos to different races to make them look more professional, that kind of stuff, which is just completely abhorrent. So it's interesting and important for us to be monitoring these use cases of what I affectionately call bad AI, but I think is much more complicated than that. Because as businesses looking to adopt technology, we need to be aware of how the technology is evolving and how that technology can potentially go awry. And that can and should inform the guardrails and practices that we adopt. So it's kind of like the old axiom that, if history is doomed to repeat itself if you don't study it. Same thing. We need to look to see what other things have gone wrong so that we can design effective practices to mitigate those risks. And I will say that as a result of some of these bad AI use cases, we do have a growing appreciation of risk. It's doing its job. We're thinking more critically about where to apply the technology, where it can go wrong. I have people that I work with in different organizations that have um, never really been aware of the broad range of AI risks, even though I live and breathe it every day. So I think it's everywhere, but quite a few people were really unaware. And it's made them more aware of the broader AI space and the broader risks in the AI space that exist when you rely on a fundamentally probabilistic system to drive a decision that probably should be deterministic.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So let's bring this to healthcare for a moment. If you're a healthcare executive listening to this conversation and thinking, "Oh my gosh, I know my organization needs to have a strategy here. I'm being asked about this. I need to have a point of view. I need to put a team on this." Where should they start? So what advice would you give to a healthcare executive who knows they need to create a competency in this area and start moving forward? Where do they start?
Healthcare is in an interesting spot, I think, because of as an already regulated industry, I think there's already a strong appreciation for the risk of new types of technology. And there's a very strong mission-driven component to how healthcare systems operate to try and serve patients and other constituents with the highest level of care. And so keeping that as central tenets to how we think about applying AI technologies broadly is a crucial component, which I think again is important to recognize that adoption of certain types of technologies might have unintended consequences on that mission. So that's an important step. Where I've seen certain organizations in the healthcare space start is, first off, there are some healthcare regulators that have been advancing guidelines in this space for some years. The FDA, in particular, granted it was around medical devices, AI and medical devices, has had some guidance for several years now. NIST has their AI risk management framework. So there are a number of these evolving documents that describe where organizations can be building new practice or augmenting existing practice to mitigate evolving risk around AI technology. So I think that's one. Recognize what you already have. Recognize everything that's already existing within an enterprise, the healthcare ecosystem, to help you identify emergent risk in this space, and then identify appropriate mitigants for that. So that's certainly one side. The second side of it is think about what the appropriate use cases really are for this technology and define an appropriate strategy. So, are there clear go no go areas as an enterprise that you need to focus on, or as a hospital system or other entity within the healthcare environment? Um, some that might look different for different organizations. There might be some organizations that are more risk averse and are looking at primarily investing in back office or middle office applications that don't really touch patient care, and maybe that's fine. There may be others that are would look to experiment with adopting machine learning technologies that might impact patient care to some degree or touch a patient at some point in time. And if that's the case, then think about what really be careful and think about the ways in which those systems could go awry. I also think the healthcare ecosystem to me feels highly collaborative and that there is an awful lot of engagement across different types of stakeholders. Um, there are industry bodies evolving in this space too to try and drive different types of standards or requirements. So engage the community, really ask a lot of questions, see how people react and respond. Uh, Always test with an end user before you implement something. Think creatively about all the ways a technology could go wrong, and really think critically about the different guardrails we might want to put in place to constrain the usage of it. I do think we are at an interesting time where it might feel like generative AI is a solution for all problems, and having a sense check within an enterprise that helps us think, does this technology really need to be used to solve the problem we have at hand? Do we already have something that can address it? Are there simpler techniques that are easier to explain or easier to oversee and govern that we can be adopting instead? Or is there a piece of this process or a piece of this life cycle that makes more sense to pass to or to offload to machine learning or automation systems, so that we can effectively continue to oversee them? So it's a number of different actions, I think. But again, I think healthcare is actually in an interesting position because there are so many practices already in place, given the highly regulated and risk appreciative landscape that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, that seems to be a common theme in your comments and advice is to not start from scratch, but to look at what you already have as a starting point. I think that's really sage advice. What do you hear as the most common objections? What are the one or two most common objections? As an executive is looking at this space and thinking, "Oh gosh, we can't do this because X." What are those, and how do you suggest people overcome those objections in an organization?
So I don't think there are too many objections at the surface to, yeah, we need to oversee this technology so we don't, unintentionally yield harm. I think that's a fairly easy argument. Where I think we run into friction are a few spaces. One, sometimes there is a misconception that harm just means security risk and privacy risk. And so breaking that down is an important conversation to have. There are many more flavors to this that are outside just the security and security and privacy space. Granted, they're both very important, but we also need to be thinking about explainability and robustness and high quality systems and problem formulation, and all of that is broader. So there's sometimes an underappreciation of what it really means to build programs around this, which means that maybe budgets aren't allocated appropriately, or teams that are actively working in this space don't necessarily get the visibility that they need to make a considerable impact. I'm seeing that change, but we all need to open our eyes. So I think that's part of it for sure.
Last question for you, Ilana. What are the best resources? So if someone wants to dive more into this space, whether it's books, blogs, podcasts, any medium, what are some of the resources that you recommend people check out?
There are so many out there. I'll obviously plug some of the PwC stuff, but we do try and write a lot on this topic. But even more broadly, the NIST AI Risk Management Framework is one of the better documents that I've seen to come out of one of the government agencies. And if you follow any of the White House announcements, there have been a number in this space over just the last few weeks. So those are great resources. The White House also has a proposed Bill of Rights on AI, which came out several months ago, outlines a lot of the topics in this space that are, I think, really, really valuable. There are a large number of books, if you actually start to dive into the space of AI ethics or responsible AI, data ethics, too many to list here. There are some great newsletters and blogs on this topic too. One I follow a lot is AI Snake Oil, which comes from a few Princeton professors. So a large number of resources. The other piece here too, though, is that industry bodies are really sharpening up to these topics too, and are starting to produce a lot of their own content and training programs. I've seen ones through IAPP, which is a privacy professional body that they announced an AI governance certification that came out just a few weeks ago, or just a week ago, and they're starting to roll that out. So there are a number of resources in this space. I would say just keep an open mind, read whatever you can, listen to whatever podcasts you can. You'd be surprised how many different perspectives exist in this space. And I think all of those help us open our minds.
Those are great. And you know what? I realized there's one other thing before we wrap. I do want to ask you. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, you were on this space, long before it became popular. How did you end up passionate about this space? How did you get to responsible AI years before it became the topic of popular conversation?
A little bit of luck, quite a bit of interest. I mean, I'm fortunate to work for an organization that has trust as part of its central mission. And so when we started building, I started building machine learning systems as part of an innovation lab years back. And as part of that work, we realized we started getting some questions about what it meant to explain deep learning systems in particular. And that got us on this wide journey of, well, it's not just explainability, there are a whole host of other factors that we should be thinking about. And holy moly, there's a lot more in this space. And uh, a lot of the early research that I saw in this space really opened my eyes. And I realized at that time that not a lot of people outside of small groups really understood these issues, or were talking about these issues. And so it kind of kicked me off on that journey. But I stand on the shoulders of many academic giants and many industry giants in this space who have been advocating for these topics since before me as well. So just very proud and excited to be part of the chain of people amplifying this.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for so many practical tips and insights into this space. I'm sure it will be very useful for many people listening. So thanks again, and always great to see you.
Great to see you too. Thank you for having me.